Good afternoon. Today I have not managed to go to my office to record the video because it is raining out here. But there's something I wanted to explain. When you add sodium hydroxide to a solution containing calcium ions, so this is simply, maybe you have a calcium chloride solution, but our interest is calcium ions, then you add sodium hydroxide. Anytime you add a solution to another solution, they exchange ions. So I have my calcium chloride solution, I add sodium hydroxide solution in it. So they'll exchange ion. Sodium will take the chloride from calcium, and calcium will take the hydroxide from sodium. So there'll be formation of calcium hydroxide and sodium chloride. In the same, if I take another sample of solution of calcium chloride, I add to ammonium hydroxide solution, they will still exchange ions. So there will be formation of ammonium chloride and calcium hydroxide. So meaning, if I add sodium hydroxide to a solution containing calcium ions, the compound of calcium formed is the same with the one formed when I add ammonium hydroxide. Because in both cases, we've seen that calcium hydroxide is formed. Now, why is there a precipitate in this when you add sodium hydroxide and there's no precipitate when you add ammonium hydroxide? But the product, the calcium compound formed in both cases are simply calcium hydroxide. Now, let's now give you the reason why there's a precipitate when you add sodium hydroxide and there's no precipitate when you add ammonium hydroxide to solution containing calcium ions. This is the reason. Sodium hydroxide is a very strong base. The strength of a base is normally measured by the number of hydroxide ions it can produce in a solution. Ammonium hydroxide is a weak base, so it can give very few hydroxide ions. So the calcium hydroxide formed when you add sodium hydroxide to a solution of calcium is in large quantity. The calcium hydroxide ni mingi. So some dissolve, some won't dissolve. Hence they form a suspension, which is white in color, which we simply call precipitate. But if I add ammonium hydroxide, the hydroxide ions given by ammonium hydroxide are very few, so the calcium hydroxide formed is very little. And calcium hydroxide ikiwa kidogo, it is slightly water soluble. So you will not see a suspension. You will not see a precipitate. I'm explaining again. This is how I can identify a solution containing calcium ions. So first, I add sodium hydroxide, and there's formation of a white precipitate. To a solution containing calcium ions, I add sodium hydroxide, I see the precipitate. The precipitate simply means an insoluble substance. Now, what is this precipitate formed when I add sodium hydroxide in a solution containing calcium ion? Is simply calcium hydroxide. Why is it forming? The calcium hydroxide form ni nyingi sana, ambapo zingine hazita dissolve because calcium hydroxide is slightly soluble. So kwa sababu iko mingi, it won't dissolve. It will form a precipitate. But when I add ammonium hydroxide to a calcium ion, it will also form calcium hydroxide. But since ammonium hydroxide is a very weak base, the number of hydroxide ions are very few. So the calcium hydroxide form ni kidogo sana ambapo ina dissolve. So there is no white precipitate. Thank you. So this explains why ammonium hydroxide do not form precipitate with calcium ions, while sodium hydroxide forms. The precipitate is simply an insoluble calcium hydroxide when you add sodium hydroxide. When you add ammonium hydroxide, the calcium hydroxide is still formed, but quantity is very little, and it dissolves and doesn't show the precipitate. Thank you.